You know, when we think back to history class, we remember the big dates, the famous names, a very specific story of how America came to be. But what if that story, the one we all memorized for the test, was missing some pretty crucial chapters?
So the question is, was the version of history you were taught the complete picture? Or was it, maybe, a simplified narrative? Today, we're going to look at the parts of the American story that often get left on the cutting room floor. These are the details that add incredible depth and complexity to what we think we know.
So let's start at the very beginning with the ideological architecture of the United States. We often ask, where did the Founding Fathers get their revolutionary ideas? Well, as it turns out, the standard answer is only part of the story. Now, every single textbook will tell you that the founders were students of the European Enlightenment. You know, that they looked back to ancient Greece, the Roman Republic, and the principles laid out in the Magna Carta. And that's absolutely true. But it's an incomplete picture. There was another, far more immediate influence that is rarely ever mentioned. See, alongside all those classic influences from Europe, there was a powerful political entity right on the colonists' own doorstep, the Iroquois Confederacy. This was an incredibly sophisticated union of 6 nations that had already mastered what we now call a federal system, you know, where individual states maintain their own governance but are united under one national framework. It was a living, breathing example of the very structure the colonies were struggling to create. And don't just take my word for it. This isn't some modern speculation. This is Benjamin Franklin himself writing way back in 1744, and he's pointing directly to the Iroquois as a model. He's basically asking, hey, if these 6 nations can pull off such a perfect union, why can't we? The idea of a federal system wasn't just some abstract theory from ancient books, it was a practical reality being demonstrated right next door. All right, so let's turn to the next pillar of American history, the Revolution. The story we all know is one of high-minded ideals, a fight against tyranny symbolized by one very famous protest. But the economic pressures that actually led to war, well, they started much earlier, and they were about something far more tangible than tea. This is the classic story, right? You've got angry colonists, they're fed up with taxes imposed by a distant king, so they dump a bunch of tea into Boston Harbor. It's a powerful, simple narrative, a fight for the principle of representation. And while that was certainly a factor, there was a much bigger economic driver that was already causing some really deep tension. Just look at the year 1763. That's a full decade before the Boston Tea Party. This is when the British Proclamation Line basically slammed the door shut on westward expansion. Now, for wealthy speculators like George Washington, who had invested fortunes in this now forbidden land, this wasn't some abstract grievance. No, this was a direct threat to their wealth. The revolution wasn't just about ideals, it was also a high-stakes real estate war. So you might be asking, why would the British do this? Well, from their perspective, it was a totally pragmatic policy. It protected the incredibly lucrative fur trade they had going with indigenous nations. And just as importantly, it was meant to prevent the kind of expensive, bloody frontier conflicts that would cost the crown a fortune to manage. But for the colonists, with their eyes on the West, it felt like an economic stranglehold. Now, this theme of expansion, it leads us right to the next great American myth, the settling of the West. Our perception of this entire era has been almost completely shaped by Hollywood. But the reality, well, it was far less wild, and frankly, far more regulated than the movies would have us believe.
We can all picture it, can't we? Dusty streets, a lone sheriff, chaotic saloons, and gunfights breaking out at a moment's notice. It's this powerful image of rugged individualism and a complete lack of law and order. The only problem is, the historical records, they paint a very, very different picture. 0. Just take that in for a moment. In one of the most famously wild towns of the West, Dodge City, the number of firearms legally allowed to be carried on your person within the city limits was 0. This one fact completely upends that whole Hollywood narrative of a lawless frontier. The reality of the West was one of surprising order and corporate control. I mean, towns like Tombstone and Dodge City had actual ordinances requiring visitors to disarm. The era wasn't really defined by individual gunslingers so much as it was by massive corporate interests, you know, the railroads and the mining companies expanding their reach. And that iconic cowboy, he was typically a low-wage, overworked migrant laborer. And get this, very often of Mexican or African-American heritage, a demographic that has been largely erased from the popular myth. So why does it matter? Why should we uncover these influences, these motives, these realities? Does it somehow diminish the story of America?
I'd argue it does the exact opposite.
By acknowledging the Iroquois influence, or the economic drivers of the revolution, or the regulated reality of the West, we move beyond a simple caricature of history. We see the founders not just as philosophical geniuses, but as pragmatic leaders learning from their neighbors. We see the revolution as a complex event driven by both ideals and financial interests. We see the West not as a lawless fantasy, but as a place of work, regulation, and diversity. The story becomes richer, messier, and far more real.
Because in the end, history isn't something that's finished and locked away in a book. It's a continuous conversation. It's an ongoing argument where new evidence constantly challenges the old narratives. The real question is, what other parts of the story have we